the woman in room 209. Nurse Danielle had been working the night shift at St. Mark's Medical Center for nearly 8 years. She had seen almost everything: patients talking in their sleep, whispered prayers in the dark, the occasional death, and the eerie silence that settled over the hospital at 3 a.m. She thought she was used to the strangeness of working in a place where life and death were so closely intertwined. But what happened in room 209 still haunted her. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of shift where time seemed to stretch and slow. The fluorescent hallway lights buzzed softly, and the scent of antiseptic and stale coffee filled the air. The ICU was unusually quiet, with only a few nurses moving between rooms. Danielle was at the nurse's station going through patient charts when she heard it. A whisper, faint but distinct. A soft, murmuring voice coming from down the hall. Danielle frowned. It was coming from room 209. That didn't make sense. Room 209 was empty. The last patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway, had passed away the day before. The bed had been stripped, the four-stand pushed to the corner, and no one had been assigned to the room since. She stood up slowly, glancing at the monitor that displayed all the rooms in the ICU. Room 209's screen was dark, no vital signs, no movement. So why did she hear whispering? Gripping her clipboard tightly, she walked down the hall. The whispering continued, soft, rhythmic, almost like someone was praying. Her heart pounded. She reached the doorway and hesitated, staring into the dimly lit room. The emergency exit sign at the end of the hallway cast a red glow across the floor, making the shadows look longer, deeper. Danielle took a breath and stepped inside. The room was empty. She exhaled, shaking her head. She was exhausted, that was all. Lack of sleep, too much coffee, too many night shifts. But just as she turned to leave, the bathroom door creaked. She froze. It was open just slightly, and the whispering was coming from inside. Danielle's skin prickled. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy, charged with something unseen. Slowly, she reached out and pushed the door open. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. Just white tiles, a sink, and the faint scent of disinfectant. The mirror reflected her own wide-eyed face, her breath coming a little too fast. She let out a shaky laugh. "Get it together, Danielle." She turned off the light and left the room. But as she walked down the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Then she heard it. Beep. Her stomach dropped. She turned, staring at the open doorway of room 209. The heart monitor, which wasn't even plugged in, was pulsing. A slow, rhythmic beep. Danielle's chest tightened. She took a step forward, peering into the room. The monitor's green light flickered, casting shadows along the walls. Then, the monitor flatlined. A long, high-pitched tone echoed through the room before the screen went dark. Danielle's radio crackled to life. "Danielle." The night shift supervisor's voice buzzed through. She swallowed. "Yeah. Are you in 209? Danielle felt the blood drain from her face. I was just there." "Why?" A long pause. Then, in a low, hesitant voice, the supervisor said, "We just got a call from that room's line." Danielle's breath hitched. Slowly, she turned toward the bedside phone. The red call light was on. She took a step back. Her mouth went dry. The phone line had been disconnected since Mrs. Holloway's death. Her radio crackled again. "Pick it up." Danielle shook her head. No way." Her heart was hammering so hard she thought she might faint. But something deep inside her told her that if she didn't answer, it would keep calling. So, with a trembling hand, she reached out and lifted the receiver. For a second, there was silence. Then, a whisper. "Help me." Danielle dropped the phone. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding down the hall, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She didn't stop until she reached the nurse's station, her hands shaking as she grabbed the desk for support. Security was called. They checked the call logs. A single 3-second recording had been captured before the call cut off. A whisper, "Help me." But room 209 was still empty, and the phone was unplugged. The man in the elevator. Nurse Lisa Carter had worked at Pinecrest Memorial Hospital for over a decade. She had her fair share of strange experiences, odd noises in empty hallways, lights flickering in rooms where patients had just passed away, and the occasional unexplained movement caught on security cameras. But nothing compared to what happened in the elevator. It was 4:12 a.m. on a cold November night. The hospital was quiet, with only a few nurses making their rounds. Lisa was coming back from the morgue, where she had just finished escorting an elderly patient's body to the cold storage. It was something she had done hundreds of times. Routine. She pressed the 7 button for the ICU floor and leaned against the metal wall, rubbing her eyes. The elevator doors slid shut, and the car began its slow, humming ascent. Then, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floors, the elevator shuddered. Lisa's stomach flipped as the car came to an abrupt halt. The overhead light flickered. She sighed. Not again. The hospital's old elevators occasionally stalled, but they always started up again within a few seconds. She waited, staring at the glowing red numbers above the door. But something felt off. The air inside the elevator was cold, much colder than it had been a second ago. Lisa wrapped her arms around herself, exhaling a shaky breath. That's when she noticed it. A smell. Faint at first, but growing stronger. Rotting flesh. Lisa's pulse spiked. She had worked around dead bodies before, but this was different. This was wrong. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. And then, somewhere behind her in the small, enclosed elevator, she heard breathing. Slow. Labored. As if someone were right there in the cramped space with her. Her breath hitched. The tiny hairs on her arms rose. The overhead light flickered again. Lisa turned her head slowly, every nerve in her body screaming at her not to look. But she did. And she wasn't alone. A man stood in the far corner of the elevator. Pale. Gaunt. His hospital gown hung off his bony frame. His sunken eyes locked directly on hers. Lisa's chest tightened. She had never seen him before, yet something about him felt horribly familiar. His mouth opened. A low, wet gurgle bubbled up from his throat. Lisa slammed her hand against the emergency call button. Nothing. Her heart pounded. She pressed it again. Nothing. The elevator doors remained shut. She turned back toward the man. He was closer. Too close. Lisa stumbled backward, her back hitting the metal wall. The man's lips moved. He was whispering something too soft to hear. But then, he lunged. Lisa let out a choked scream. The lights cut out. Total darkness. For 3 long seconds, she stood frozen, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then, the elevator lurched. The lights flickered back on. Lisa spun around. The man was gone. The smell? Gone. The only thing left was the distant ding as the doors slid open. Lisa stumbled out onto the 7th floor, her hands trembling. A security guard, noticing her pale face, frowned. "You okay?" Lisa stared at him, then at the empty elevator. She opened her mouth to speak, but then she saw it. The mirror inside the elevator, and the faint, smeared handprint on the glass. Security reviewed the footage later. The camera inside the elevator showed Lisa standing alone. But for exactly 3 seconds, when the lights went out, the screen glitched, and in that brief, flickering moment, a second figure appeared, standing right behind her. The patient who never left. Nurse Catherine Monroe had always prided herself on keeping a cool head. At Ridgeway General Hospital, she had seen her share of trauma, death, and the unexplainable. But nothing, not the midnight codes, not the eerie quiet of an empty ward, not even the way the building seemed to breathe at night had ever truly scared her. Until she met Mr. Avery. It was a rainy Thursday night, and Catherine was pulling a double shift in the hospital's geriatric wing. Most of her patients were asleep, their slow breathing punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors. She had just finished checking vitals when the call light for room 316 blinked on. Catherine frowned. Room 316 had been empty for weeks. She grabbed her clipboard and made her way down the dimly lit hallway. The door to 316 stood slightly ajar, revealing the darkened room beyond. She knocked lightly before stepping inside. "Hello!" Silence. The air was stale, cold. The faint scent of disinfectant lingered in the air, but beneath it, something else, a hint of decay. She reached for the call button panel. The red light was still blinking. She pressed it, resetting the system. A malfunction. At least that's what she told herself. Catherine turned to leave, and froze. There was a man sitting in the chair by the window, thin, bald. His hospital gown hung off his bony frame, and his sunken eyes stared straight ahead. Her breath caught. How did he get in here? "Sir," she said cautiously. "This room isn't in use. Are you lost?" No response. He sat motionless, his skeletal hands clutching the armrests. Catherine took a step closer. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" The man's lips parted. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I never left." A chill rippled down Catherine's spine. She reached for the call button, but then the lights flickered, and when they came back on, the chair was empty. Catherine stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Her brain scrambled for a logical explanation. A patient who had wandered in? A trick of exhaustion? She backed out of the room and shut the door firmly. But the unease stayed with her. Later, she checked the patient records for room 316. The last occupant had been a man named Walter Avery. He had died 3 months ago, in that very chair. Catherine's stomach twisted. She knew what exhaustion could do to the mind, but she had seen him, clear as day. She tried to put it out of her head, tried to move on, until 3 nights later when room 316's call light blinked on again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed a security guard, Officer Grayson, and together they went to check. The door was closed. Catherine pushed it open. The chair was facing the window again, empty. But the second she stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Grayson, standing behind her, shivered. "Jesus, it's freezing in here." Catherine reached for the call panel. The light was still blinking. She reset it. Silence. Then, a breath. Right behind her. She spun around, nothing. But Grayson's face went pale. "Catherine," he murmured. "Look at the bed." Her eyes followed his, and her blood turned to ice. The sheets neatly folded just moments ago were now pressed down, as if someone were lying there. Then the monitor, the one that wasn't plugged in, started beeping. Steady. Rhythmic. A heartbeat. Catherine and Grayson stumbled backward. The beeping sped up. The lights flickered again, and in the split second before the room plunged into darkness, the chair by the window creaked, and a whisper soft, breathy, "I never left." Security reviewed the footage. The camera caught Catherine and Grayson, but when they played back the moment the lights flickered, for a brief, flickering second, there was a third figure, sitting in the chair, just as he always had. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.